Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is Kyle Dickman. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, you have written this remarkable book. It's called On the Burning Edge, A Fateful Fire and the Men Who Fought It. And it's so well written, and the story is so tragic. Tell us a little about the book and what caused you to read it. Tell us about your background.
So, the book actually grew out of a magazine story. So I used to work for Outside Magazine, and I had been sent to Prescott to report about the tragedy. That magazine, the story was quite successful. It was nominated for a National Magazine Award, and shortly after it came out, publishers got in touch with me and said, would you be interested in doing a book about it? So
we have to tell what it is.
Oh, I'm sorry. So 2013, there was a fire that started outside of Yarnell,
Arizona.
It was burning up on top of this ridgeline, and after 2 days of burning, they deployed the Granite Mountain Hot Shots to this fire, and a thunderstorm rolled over the fire. The fire effectively exploded, and 19 men were killed. And so the story is about what happened out there that day, and also it sort of sets the context of why it is that young men keep dying fighting fires, and why we have to expect them to continue to die unless we change policies or approach.
Now, you yourself served as a hotshot for how many years?
I was a hotshot for 1 year, but I fought fire for 5 total.
And you're considered a bit of a wildfire expert. You've been on NPR, CNN, Al Jazeera.
Yeah,
Do they have to worry about wildfire?
Al Jazeera, yeah.
Slate, there's a lot of where you've come, because one of the things you're pointing out is that we might be doubling down on failed policies the way we're continuing to fight forest fires.
Yeah, I think that's right. So our current approach to wildfire is that we suppress or extinguish most fires when they're put, after they start. And the idea is that so we got into the suppression game around 1910, and by 1950 we were excellent at it. And the problem with that is that most western forests are adapted to fire, and so in the absence of flames, they became incredibly dense. And so when fires do start, there's more fuel to burn. Excuse me. So the result is that you've got these really high-intensity fires, and now we have 140 million people living in fire-prone lands. And so we're having a lot more, we're seeing 3 times the number of houses burned every year that we saw just 10 years ago. Much more acreage burned than we saw, 6 times more acreage burned every year than 40 years ago. So fires have really become a defining issue in Western land management.
You spoke, I heard you at a book signing for this book, you mentioned the number of trees per acre has gone from what to what?
Roughly. Roughly. Here, actually, in the Sangre de Cristos behind Santa Fe, there's 1,300 trees per acre, where a century ago there were just 150. And so, you can see, just imagine, if, just think about adding more fuel to your campfire, and that's literally what's happening in the forests.
Then there's the element of climate change, because I've read that climate change is making wildfires worse, and wildfires are making climate change worse.
Right.
Could you riddle me that?
Yeah. No, it's a little bit, it is a little strange. So I'll start with saying, climate change is, of course, happening. We've seen a 1.7 degree temperature increase since the 1970s, and so we're forecast, climatologists predict we'll see between 4 and 6 degree temperature increase by the end of this century. So the problem is that warmer air holds more moisture than cooler air, and so it will literally just wick the forests, these already thicker forests, dry, and we'll see bigger fires. But every time a fire starts, you're releasing CO2 into the atmosphere, and so with these huge burns, you're releasing all the CO2 that's in that the trees or the brush holds, and so then you have faster increases in temperatures. A
self-perpetuating cycle.
Yeah, it's not ideal.
So there's so many elements that you talk about: the human encroachment in what used to be wild areas, perhaps a dysfunctional fire management system.
Yeah, I think Dysfunctional. Maybe that's a little strong. So I think mostly I guess the way I would describe it is we've been sort of backed into current policies. So when we started, we got into this game in 1910, and we're now at a point where I don't think that most agencies feel that they can rapidly change their approach to wildfires, because there are so many. What I like to say is that wildfires aren't natural disasters until they burn something that we value. But there's so much out there that we value now that I think the agencies feel obligated, both they feel a lot of political pressure for one thing, but obligated to suppress keep fires small before they get big and destructive. So the problem is that every time you stop a small fire, then the forests have an opportunity to get thick, and so the next fire that comes through is going to burn bigger, hotter, more destructive.
So there have been famous fires in the past, sort of like, landmarks. Can you speak about the ones that are strongest in your mind right now?
Sure, yeah. So I think, I'd start with 1910. So the Forest Service was founded in 1905, but it was sort of became what it is today, which is mostly a fire agency, to be honest with you, in 1910 when 3 million acres burned in Idaho. And there were 78 men killed, firefighters killed in that fire. And that was the first time that we really saw the Forest Service get involved with firefighting. Let me see, 1949, the Man Gulch Fire, 13 smoke jumpers were killed. That was a huge blaze. And then, of course, the Griffith Park fire of 1930s.
Yeah.
And then the other big, there's no shortage of tragedy fires in the history of this, fire suppression. But the last big one was 1994 when 14 men died, and 14 men and women died.
Is that Storm King?
Storm King, that's right.
Yeah.
So I mean, you can see, I think the reason that's important is because if we look back, every 10 to 15 years we see a fire like this. So, where a bunch of men or women die. And I think we have to stop being shocked by the deaths. I mean, maybe that's the wrong way to put it, but we have to stop being surprised by them, because I think if we keep fighting these fires and you keep putting men and women in the path of these high intensity blazes, one of the consequences is that tragedy is going to happen. It's just too dynamic, and wildfires are burning much too hot, and so.
What does the term megafire mean? Is that a new construct?
I don't know. It depends who you ask. I don't really like the term myself. I think that it's sort of it's a little bit misleading. I think it's like, Sharknado or something like that. It's like, it just doesn't. But what it means to me is a fire that it costs a whole lot of money. So we've seen fires throughout the history of, in the 1800s, there were at least 6 fires that were larger by, I think, a factor of 4 than anything we've seen in the last century. But today, because they weren't burning houses, we didn't call those mega fires. So now I think when we spend whatever, $20 million fighting a fire, or $40 million fighting a fire, then that's a mega fire.
You recently shadowed, is his name Harper? Tom Harper?
Tom Harper.
Harper. Well, tell me what his role is. And is he not, in effect, the chief of the largest firefighting force in the world?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. So under his command, he has 10,000 wildland firefighters, roughly 10,000 firefighters who work for the Forest Service. And Tom's job is to figure out, not to set policy, but to make all the decisions that trickle all the way up to the top. I mean, he's he's a manager, basically, but... I'm not quite sure how to describe exactly what he does. He spends a lot of time working with Congress, because a lot of times, congressmen or representatives have questions for him about how fire policy works, what he would like to see changed. I think.
Does he also have to lobby them for funds?
I don't know the answer to that. I think he probably does lobby them for funds, but
because the cost of fighting these fires is huge. Is it a $4.7 billion per year?
Yeah, between federal, state, and county.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a lot. And the Forest Service spends a little over $1 billion, and I think this year they'll spend between $1 and $2 billion fighting fires. And so what's interesting about that is that is the way that the Forest Service's budget is set up is that they're now at a point that 50% of the Forest Service's budget goes toward fire. And it used to be, as recently as 1995, that number was 16%.
Oh.
And so it is sort of, there's all these other land management responsibilities that the Forest Service has, but they no longer have the funds to take care of things like recreation or biology and whatever else. And so fire is actually cannibalizing other parts of the agency. And I think what's important about that is, for instance, there's one bill in Congress right now that would fully fund what the Forest Service needs to suppress fires, but the agency wouldn't get a larger budget, so fire would just continue to take up more. If trends continue like they are, fire is just going to continue to take up more and more of the agency's budget until it's literally, the United States Fire Service.
I want to go look a good close look at your book On the Burning Edge. You served as a hotshot. There's 107 hotshot teams in the country, more or less.
Yeah, it's always changing, but yeah.
So this was a Granite Mountain Hot Shots, and you say they're different because they were a municipal hotshot team. Why hasn't any other municipality done that?
Well, they have. It's not so. They weren't the only. They were one of very few, and I think the resistance is that. Is what if a scenario like Yarnell Hill plays out, and so the city of Prescott is, they I don't know if they're $50 million in debt but I mean the fatalities of these 19 men cost that city huge amounts of money, and I think that it became a lesson, it became a warning for a bunch of other cities. What's really tragic about it is that Prescott has a very progressive fire department, and the fact that they had Granite Mountain, the Hot Shots, the fact that they hosted them was actually required a lot of foresight, because initially the crew was started as what's called a fuels crew, and their job was to go out, use chainsaws and chippers to sort of thin the brush around the city of Prescott. And so when fires did start, they would sit down, burn less intensely when they came to the edge of town, and firefighters would have an opportunity to stop them before homes burned. Yeah, and so I think the real tragedy among so many other pieces of this is that we're not going to see. I think other municipalities are going to be very cautious about hosting fuels crews or fire crews in the future.
One of the more poignant aspects of the community-based hotshot team is how close they all were, and you flesh out the human dimension and the background stories. These are no longer 19 anonymous people by the time you're done with it. You really did a very deep job. Would you mind telling us the kind of medium version of who these people were and then what happened? We need to tell the story of what happened, and we can never know ultimately why they left to safety, but just talk a little about the story that is in this book.
Well, so the story starts at the beginning of the 2013 season, and as we just talked about, what makes this crew so unique is that they were hosted by a municipality, and hotshots tend to be sort of they're very competitive, and it's like people, it's an elite organization, and you have to earn the respect of other hotshot crews, and so these guys had to sort of fight to get the respect of other hotshot crews. They were very community oriented. A lot of these guys were young. They had families. A lot of them went to church, and all of these things. Every crew has guys who, with families or who go to church, but there was just a higher percentage of them on Granite Mountain. And on June 30th, the hotshots Yarnell Hill fire has started, and they're out working this fire, and they're up on this ridge line, and they're watching this fire burn, and it's burning up and toward the north. And then sometime around 3 o'clock, some thunderstorms form, and these thunderstorms produce these 30 to 40 mile an hour winds, and suddenly what was this relatively sleepy flank of the fire goes from 2-foot flames to 10-foot flames to 20 to 30, and it starts sweeping toward the town of Yarnell. And from where the hotshots are, from where Granite Mountain is, they can see everything happening, and they can see that very soon the town of Yarnell is likely to burn, which ultimately it does. So around 4 o'clock, they make the decision to leave what's called the safety of the black. So black is the already burned fuel, and they walk 1.5 miles through the exposed brush, drop down into this box canyon close to this place. Their intended destination was called the Helms Place, and it's another safety zone. It's a house that had defensible space that didn't burn. About 1/4 mile from the Helms Place, fire rounded this ridgeline. 80-foot flames swept up, and all 19 of the men were killed.
No, they did deploy. We're speaking today with Kyle Dickman about his book On the Burning Edge, describing the Yarnell Hill tragedy where 19 firefighters were killed. They did deploy their fire shelters.
That's right, yeah.
As a last ditch. They've made a defensible space. They deployed their fire shelters, but the temperatures were how hot?
As high as 2,000 degrees, so it was much too hot. The fire shelters were, they were not designed to survive that sort of temperature threshold, and so, what was left of them was gory, to say the least.
One member of the crew was sent out to be the lookout, and I know how bonded this brotherhood is among hotshots. What happened to him?
So earlier in the day, Eric Marsh is the superintendent of the crew, and Jesse Steed, who was the captain, they made the decision to send the guy's name is Brendan McDonough down into this valley below the ridge line to serve as a lookout, and he was going to watch to make sure a fire didn't start below the men and rush up at him. But it put him in a totally separate place than the rest of the crew, and so around when the winds shifted, he was actually the first. Investigators would later find that if he hadn't have been miraculously picked up by this guy in a four-wheeler, he would have been the first fatality on the Yarnell Hill fire. But as it happened, the wind shifted. He ran off of his lookout. The superintendent of another hotshot crew was on his four-wheeler, rushed out, grabbed Donut, and sort of swept him out of harm's path. And so he was not with the crew when his 19 colleagues, crewmates were killed.
I think one of the spookiest events that you described, he's sitting in the truck, the hotshot truck, and all of their phones are in there. A lot of their phones are in there, and there's this buzzing and chiming of text messages coming in, all their loved ones wanting to know, are you all right? Are you all right? And he finally had to leave the vehicle because it was just handle it. Too tragic.
Yeah, it was just totally overwhelmed. I mean, I can't imagine how he felt, and as a result of that, I mean, there's a number of incidents that sort of, when he and I talked that he said stand out in his mind. So it was the buzzing of the phones. There had been a few hours earlier, a helicopter and an airplane, from his perspective, it had almost collided, and sort of these moments now, when he talked, he told me about having flashbacks to these moments because he's now dealing with PTSD and survivor's guilt, and just sort of coping with, how do you deal with being the one guy who survived and like in a very strange way made famous because 19-year closest friends died.
Well, is he doing all right?
He's doing okay. I think he's having a tough go. I mean, as anybody would. He left the fire department, and he is now he for a while he was working with the Wildland Firefighter Foundation, which is this great organization out of Boise that raises money for the families of fallen firefighters. But I think he's left that and is now focusing on healing, and he's also trying to start like a center for PTSD victims or sufferers, and for first responders, so policemen, firemen, nurses, whoever else.
Well, I will say that what I've observed of fire departments and hotshot crews, the bond is so deep, and the way they honor the memory of each other, it's very deeply moving. Well, I wish him well. You had described this in a way as death by best of intentions. So perhaps because we'll never know why they left the safety of the black, perhaps they were going to try to save that.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I think that's the only, for me, that's the most logical conclusion, because they had been actually sort of sidelined the whole day. I mean, this fire was burning more intensely than almost any blaze most of the firefighters on scene had ever seen, and these guys hadn't really been a part of the action. So, and I think that around 4 o'clock, they saw these houses likely to burn, and they felt that they were in a position, even though ultimately, of course, they weren't, they felt that they were in a position to help. And so they went down to try to, there were 650 people living in the town of Yarnell. Most of them had not evacuated by the time these guys had died. And, it's a complete miracle that we didn't see any civilian deaths in Yarnell. Yeah.
That's another very moving part. The other firefighters going to try to get these people out of town. They find old people walking on the road when they're jammies, and you know, people who are trying to help a handicapped person, and that's also very moving. Let's talk about defensible space, because this is something that we in the West must pay attention to.
Absolutely.
So, obviously, if you have moved into the national forest and the national forest burns, you should protect your home, be it replacing wooden decks with flagstone or replacing the roofing material to something and getting rid of tree canopies. Are people just in denial? It's not going to happen here. Just me and the chipmunks will be fine.
I can't speak for them. I don't know. It's very strange to me, but I think they just don't think about it. Like, you know, I mean, this has been in Santa Fe, where I live. We haven't. When there was no smoke this year, we didn't really see any big fires, and I think it's pretty easy to forget that even if you're living in a place that can burn and probably will burn in the next 5 to 20 years, if it's not burning that summer, it's not in the front of your mind, and you're going to go about your life doing all these other things that these busy people have to do. But
well, we've been blessed with a huge amount of rain this year, so we give thanks.
Yeah.
But we remember the Los Alamos fires, two of them.
Goodness. Yeah.
And the first one, when all those homes burned, and you'd watch on television, people would be seeing their own house burn on
Cerro
television.
Gordo and Las Conchas. I mean, those are amazing fires. And we see that, I mean, you know, we're going to see another big fire season in the near future. So I would really encourage homeowners to be proactive about it, because it's not just about saving your house. It's about lessening the responsibility that firefighters will feel for protecting it. So, you know, homes that have defensible space, I think you were just telling me your sister had a house and her house survived a fire because it had defensible space. I mean, there are countless examples of that. And so if you can, it doesn't take a lot of work or a lot of money, but if you can just kick a chainsaw, thin the brush out around your house, and so when a fire does come through, your home is less likely to burn. But also, the firefighters are going to see the houses that have defensible space, and they're going to put effort toward protecting those homes first, because they're savable.
Yeah. The issue of the fire shelters has come up. Is somebody inventing something that can, I don't know what could withstand 2,000 degrees?
Well, I mean, there's certainly technology that exists, you know. I mean, everybody says, well, we can send, you know, men can walk on the moon. Why is it that we can't create something that can survive fires? And the question isn't whether or not we can invent it. The question is whether or not we can make something that's small enough that firefighters can carry around. And, you know, they have to hike up. It's not, you know, they might walk a dozen miles a day up and over really steep terrain. They're cutting line. And it's also, we're saying that not every, you know, in Australia and Canada, two other countries where they fight wildfires, they don't even carry fire shelters. And the logic is that they think that carrying fire shelters increases the likelihood that firefighters will make high-risk decisions. And so it's important to keep in mind that fire shelters really are a latch-ditch survival tool, and nobody really ever wants to use them. So that being said, after Yarnell Hill, there was some of the families put some pressure on the Forest Service to continue to improve the fire shelters, and the Forest Service has committed to redesigning them. So we may see, you know, an improved fire shelter come out in the coming years.
You mentioned Australia, and it is said that they are taking the brunt of climate change because their bushfires are now extraordinary. You mentioned at your book signing the other night that in Australia they look at the fire plan for the area where someone wants to put in the subdivision, and if it's historically always in a fire zone, they don't grant them that permission. They go build your houses somewhere else because this is going to burn at some point.
Right.
It would be thoughtful if we could do something like that here.
Hard to argue with that.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
So what have we learned from this? I just want to tell people this is very well written and quite an exciting read, but it is so sad that these wonderful men made the sacrifice. And again, there's not a blame. This is man has fought nature and fought fires for years.
That's right.
But is there a lesson to take away from this?
I think the lesson is that I think that individual homeowners should really see this as a lesson. What I would like to see is I'd like to see homeowners be proactive about creating defensible space. And I'd like to see opposite of what we were talking about earlier with these municipalities not having fuels crews. I think the opposite should happen. I think that these cities like Yarnell or Santa Fe or Boulder or really any city in the West should have fuels crews to prepare their sounds for the wildfires that are going to come, because they will. I mean, that's just, the wildfires are a natural part of the West, and we're going to continue to see them.
And that's on the individual and the citywide level. How about nationally? Is there a move from the suppression policy? We only have a minute left. I don't know. Is there a change in federal fire policy?
So there's a number of bills that Congress is considering. All of them, through a number of different methods, would be taking less money, giving less money toward suppression and more toward preparedness. But we haven't seen any of those passed yet. So hopefully we will. And if that happens, then it's a small step, but it's a step in the right direction.
Are you active? I know you're writing for Outside Magazine, and are you drawn back to this kind of work as a firefighter, as a first responder, or are you?
Oh, I'm probably done with it.
Yeah, it's very scary.
Yeah, I mean, I miss it. There are parts of it. I miss the simplicity of it, and I have so much respect for the men and women who do that job. But at this point, I don't think I'm fit enough to do what they do, and so I will happily retire a writer.
Well, one of the reasons they spoke so openly with you is that you had walked in their boots. Mm-hmm. You had actually done that. You'd carried the 45-pound pack with the tools in hand, and so you knew what it was like. And so they were very open with you. This is a remarkable book.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Our guest today is Kyle Dickman. On the Burning Edge is his book about the 19 firefighters that perished in the Yarnell Hill fire. It's a good read. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
And I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.